On Christmas Eve 2013, a truck crossed 3 lanes on the Newport Bridge and smashed head-on into Will's car. It took 45 minutes with the jaws of life to extract Will, and he was then evacuated by helicopter to Rhode Island Hospital as a level 1 trauma patient. He had broken and shattered bones up and down the left side of his body and was in danger of losing his leg. 11 months later, after a long and painful rehab, and just as he was beginning to resume some of his normal activities, he was overcome by schizophrenia. 4 days later, on Thanksgiving 2014, Will blinded himself in his right eye in a psychiatric hospital, goaded by a demonic figure. When Will was on the bridge, he had had a vision of this woman who he believed had been his lover since the beginning of time. And the demon used that, the demon goaded Will, that if he blinded himself, that he would be reunited with her. I had suffered before in my life. Will had major surgery at 4 months old, and my wife Maureen had cancer in 2000, metastatic cancer. And we went for a whole year feeling like every seasonal thing we did was for the last time. But this was different. The intensity of what had happened on the bridge and the incomprehensibility of how, after such a courageous recovery, that he would immediately be stricken with an even more hellish affliction. It took me past the limits of my endurance, and it took me past what I thought I knew about God. It raised in every cell of my body a question which prior to that point had been more distant and philosophical. How can an all-loving, all-powerful God allow such suffering to happen, especially to the innocent? In the past, when I'd struggled spiritually, I prayed intensely, and the Spirit was there to guide me, one step at a time, through the confusion. When Will blinded himself, I prayed more intensely than I had ever prayed in my life, and God was silent. I felt abandoned and betrayed. I had accepted Will's medical illness right away. I didn't have a choice. It's the only way that I could help him. But I had great difficulty coming to terms with the demonic aspect of the illness. Illness or no illness, Will has a beautiful heart. And I could not understand how a demon was allowed to penetrate that heart, to penetrate his love. That morning on the bridge and the blinding in particular exposed old and new fault lines in my soul. While I continued to serve as a lector here and standing publicly in the Word was a lifeline for me, I was incapable of prayer otherwise. My attendance at Mass became erratic, and I would leave communion feeling unfed. I lived in this forsaken place for 4 years until May 2017, when, after a series of small graces, I learned about Padre Pio. As I read about Padre Pio and all the miracles that were associated with him, I started to feel something that I had not felt in a long time: hope. I began to pray to Padre Pio when I woke up in the morning, when I got in the shower, on the drive to work, at lunchtime walks in Roger Williams Park, at stress walks around the block in the afternoon, on the drive home, and in bed getting ready to go to sleep. My prayer at that time was for miraculous healing and for the strength to accept my suffering sacrificially. 3 months into these devotions, I was sitting on the couch alone in an unair conditioned heat wave, watching the Red Sox on TV and following a stream of empty news on my phone. At some point, I noticed an odd smell coming from my undershirt. I took off, and it had been there for a while, and I took off the shirt and threw it on the floor beside me. And a couple of minutes later, I was annoyed because the smell was getting stronger, even though the shirt was farther from me. And I took the shirt and threw it in the dirty clothes pile and went back to the couch. And then it was about 10 minutes later that I asked what should be the obvious question. What was that smell? And where did it come from? I went into the bathroom and picked up the shirt and smelled it, and the aroma was so strong, it threw my head back and so compressed, I couldn't tell what it was. And I thought irrationally, well, maybe the shirt didn't rinse right in the laundry. And it didn't make any sense because I'd been wearing the shirt all day, but I went and checked all the other shirts and they were fine. And I put my head into the laundry soap bin and it pushed my head back too, but it wasn't the smell anything like what I was smelling there. After ruling out natural causes, I finally acknowledged what I had begun to hope was true. It was Padre Pio. Padre Pio had heard my desperate prayers and chosen what he had chosen to give countless other people: mercy, love, and the gift of his presence. I was in awe. I was this tiny speck in the corner of the universe, but somehow Padre Pio knew me. Somehow this saint who had been dead for 50 years had come to comfort me. I knew from reading about Padre Pio, because I had done a lot by then, that these things happen for people, but I never thought or hoped that it would happen to me. Several hours after the intensity of the smell, it began to quiet down a little bit, and I could tell that it was lavender. And lavender is one of the most common fragrances that Padre Pio used to visit with people. And I wanted Maureen to have a chance to smell it, and Will, and I kind of zipped it in a plastic bag and laughing at myself at the same time for trying to contain a supernatural odor. In the morning, when I opened the bag and smelled it, there was just the faintest touch of lavender. If I hadn't known what I was looking for, I wouldn't have smelled it. Will was out in the living room, and I said, "Will, smell this." And he's looking at me like, "Dad, smell your undershirt? Like what's going on here?" But he smelled it and immediately said, "Oh, lavender. Are you doing aromatherapy?" I said, no, it's Padre Pio. And when I said that, Maureen was at the breakfast counter reading the news, and she came over and smelled it. And she smelled it 4 or 5 times. And she said, I'm a nurse, I have a good nose. And she didn't smell anything and said, well, maybe it wasn't meant for me. I had been praying so intently for Will that maybe that's why Maureen couldn't smell it. And I had got up and was wandering around the room. And when I sat down, Maureen said, whoa, I just had a huge burst of lavender. One night, as I prayed, I had a little relic card of Padre Pio that had been given to me by a friend who's present today. And I was praying, and as I prayed, I felt this tap on my heart. And immediately I had this intense urge to go on a pilgrimage to Padre Pio's shrine in New York City, where they have one of the gloves that covered his stigmata. As I thought about making this pilgrimage, I knew that I needed to attain some level of purity of heart. If I was to pray to Padre Pio, if I was to appeal to him, And with confession being one of Padre Pio's core mission, I knew that I needed to go to confession. And that was daunting for me. The last time I'd been to confession was 50 years earlier, when I was in fifth grade, receiving my confirmation. I finally got up the courage, and some of you may remember we were here when Father Young was here, and I called him from my work phone, and I was glad to get voicemail. I was kind of awkward to say something. And as I was leaving the message, this intense wave of lavender came through the receiver. And as I faced the challenging task to kind of assess what I'd done with my life from the ages of 10 to 60, and in particular in tricky cases like, okay, what was sinful and what wasn't here? And I kind of struggled with my conscience and the way I saw the world. And when I made my decision at one of those tricky points, Padre Pio's perfume came. And that happened to me twice more in preparing confession. As time went on, Padre Pio began to wean me of his perfume. And what I feared is that he was trying to wean me of himself. I felt by that time that Padre Pio knew everything about me. That he was intimate with my soul. For me, the perfume was coming far less frequently, and it was coming in different scents and much shorter. So it's much harder to discern whether he was there or he wasn't. And on one night, I was getting up in the middle of the night, and as soon as my foot touched the carpet, I smelled this microscopic burst of citrus. And then a couple of seconds later, and for the space of a single step, there was a figure walking beside me. I could see the figure, and I could see through the figure. I could see Padre Pio's features and his habit, but I could also see the wall behind him. As September 2018 approached, Padre Pio's 100th anniversary was coming, and I wanted to find a way to honor that. And I learned that a man named Pompilio Petrillo, who was a close friend of Padre Pio's in San Giovanni Rotondo, would be speaking at La Salette Shrine. In 1960, Pompilio began to work in San Giovanni Rotondo with Padre Pio's official photographer. His name was Elias Stiletto. And at that time, he was able to see Padre Pio 4 or 5 times a day, including at the very end of long nights when he would just sit around, sometimes with a beer, with a very small group of friends. He talked about being in the church one day with Padre Pio when this woman came up shrieking and trying to attack Padre Pio. And as Padre Pio drove the woman from the church, she said, "My boss will be back to finish the job." The next morning, Pompilio saw Padre Pio with bruises all over his face. And he asked him what happened. And Padre Pio said he fell. And that may have been true, but Pompilio didn't think it was the whole story. And he asked his friend, Father Eusebio, what had happened. And Eusebio said that in the middle of the night, they heard these screeches and bangings coming from Padre Pio's room, and they all ran to try to help him. But even though the door was unlocked, they couldn't open it. And when the sounds died down, the door opened easily, and they helped Padre Pio to his feet, and he said, "It's okay, I won." Pompilio was amenable to seeing people and praying with people. And he has a little studio north of Boston, like 200 original photos of Padre Pio. And we began to go up there with some regularity to pray with him. And he would hold, as we prayed, a piece of Padre Pio's stigmata against our foreheads. He had in the 60s, when he was in San Giovanni Rotondo, when Padre Pio was doing the consecration, he'd seen a piece fall to the altar. And that's the piece that he would bless us with. And then he had this special cross, which he would hold against our hearts as we prayed. And the story with that cross is when in 1964, Pompilio moved north of Boston. And he had this cross and he asked asked Padre Pio to bless it. And Padre Pio said some prayers over it. And he thought that he would kiss it, because that's what Padre Pio had done with other devotionals. And this day, what he did is he pulled back the glove from his stigmata and he ground the face of Jesus on the crucifix into the stigmata 3 times until the blood flowed down from the crown of thorns. And Pompilio was standing there and his legs are shaking and he almost fell. And he handed it to him and said, "Here, show them God." On All Souls Day 2018, Will and I drove up for another visit with Pompilio. My prayer at that time was to have the courage to carry my fair share of the load. And I also prayed that if Will's medical illness couldn't be healed, that the demonic component of the illness be taken from him. It had been 3.5 years at this point since Will had blinded himself. And while he was stable on his schizophrenia meds, he still had this overwhelming sense of guilt about having harmed people in past lives and feeling the need to atone for that. And that concerned me, because I worried that someday the effectiveness of the medication would waver and the demonic voice would get the upper hand and Will would blind the other eye or worse. And so as we're driving up there to Pompilio's house on the Southeast East Expressway, Will told me that he had been talking with God 2 nights earlier. And God told him that he needed to let him be assaulted by this violent man in this life in order to be forgiven and to be reunited with this visionary lover. And this made me really nervous, because it sounded an awful lot like the bargain that the demon had drove in the hospital. And I thought Will was asking for my advice, and I'm in traffic and I'm trying to come up with something, and he said, I accepted it. And my hands gripped the wheel, and I had this surge of post-traumatic stress. And then Will said, God told me that my willingness to sacrifice myself was enough, that I was forgiven, and that I would be reunited. And of course, that sounded a lot like Abraham and Isaac. And we talked about that a little bit. And Will said, I feel free. I feel a lightness in my being, a capacity for laughter. And he said, I feel like I'm ready to live my life in this world for the first time since the collision. Now, think about that what you may. 5 minutes later, we get to Pompilio's house, and the first thing he says is, Will, you are free. Go, live your life. And Pompilio had been praying intensely to Padre Pio on our behalf 2 nights earlier, the same night that Will had his conversation with God. And in Pompilio's prayer, Padre Pio had an answer for him, which required a great sacrifice on Pompilio's part. And he's asked me not to mention the details of that sacrifice. And Pompilio at this time had only known Will for about a month. And he had never done something like what was asked of him for anyone in the 50 years he'd been in the US. But he said yes to Padre Pio. He said, I had to do something. You've suffered so much. And Padre Pio drove the demon from Will the instant Pompilio gave him that gift. Will was freed. He had been consumed with guilt and with past lives. He had an appointment ready to see a past life regression counselor. Gone immediately. Will had changed more in that single instant of communion than he had in the last year and a half or two that he'd been home from the hospital. So to wrap up, finally, on a weekday, I wanted to stress a couple of things. One is that Padre Pio entered into people's lives, and he continues to enter into people's lives for many different reasons. But his purpose in helping people is always the same. It's to bring them closer to God. And the miraculous events that flow through the saint, in and of themselves, are far less important than the changes that are brought about in the believer as a result. Padre Pio took up residence in my soul 7.5 years ago. I believe that he's adopted me as his spiritual son, as I believe he's done that for Will. I love him in a way that I did not know it was possible to love. And his love has changed me in a number of ways. He's become a role model for me about how to accept suffering sacrificially, while at the same time being there when I'm not strong enough to bear the load. As a saint who placed tremendous emphasis on confession, he taught me what it takes to seek forgiveness authentically and to do that regularly. From the very outset, Padre Pio stressed the importance about attending Mass faithfully. And while in my bad times I'd got erratic, I have taken that lesson to heart. Padre Pio, by the authority of his experience, taught me about the reality of the devil. And in particular, he taught me about the insidious way that the devil can harm people who are on an intentional spiritual journey. By the authority of his experience also, he helped me to find a way to be in the presence of the real presence of the Eucharist. And finally, he taught me something about how to let spiritual blessings settle into my soul. I learned this from Padre Pio, but there's a very brief quote from a Norwegian monk, Erik Varden, that I think says it clearer. For to remain in that place of light, I must know that I am a guest brought in out of darkness. I must learn to respond to grace with grace, to take nothing for granted, and so to be able to receive everything as a gift. So thank you again for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it.